Hi, this is Paul, back in Sacramento. Lots of stuff has happened on YouTube. One of the things that dropped was Peterson on Joe Rogan again. And I've watched up until the Peterson Academy thing when Peterson basically talks about we who wrestle with God. And so I'll talk a little bit about that section and then a few other thoughts. First thing, somebody warned me that, oh, they're going to talk about psychedelics. What was interesting about this was Peterson, again, when he's talking about the book, he immediately sort of flips into the biblical stories, and he's been doing that a ton. And that's, of course, what he's been doing with his book. And what's interesting to me is that Peterson flipping into the biblical stories flipped Joe Rogan into a long monologue about psychedelics and how it's bad that psychedelics were banned. And it's very interesting that for Rogan, he sort of associates religion with psychedelics. And that's, I think, an important turn for Rogan. Of course, there's a lot of talk about Joe Rogan's faith, and Joe Rogan believes in psychedelics, and beyond that, it sounds like sort of a certain perennialism surrounding psychedelics, and that's kind of where he's at. And after Rogan talked a long time about psychedelics, I sort of wondered what Peterson would do. And it was interesting that Peterson sort of pivoted at that point and talked about how, in fact, when he was at Harvard, he was in Timothy Leary's chair, and why the psychedelic revolution of the 60s and 70s produced the kind of pushback that it did. And that's where Peterson sort of turns and says, your insight beyond the physical world, which is sort of what Joe Rogan is pushing at, your insight beyond the physical world should lead you into a posture of responsibility towards stability and well-being in the physical world. And the reason that the psychedelic renaissance went wrong, that happened in the 60s and 70s, went wrong, is that it basically just flipped people into individual hedonism, which wound up being destructive for society. And so that was a very interesting turn, because, of course, Peterson has talked a lot about psychedelics before, and he didn't necessarily say sort of counter Joe and stop him, but rather said the goal of all of this is stability. Now, as I was listening to Rogan talk about that and noticing the redirection that Peterson took him on, I was thinking about the Jesus people and the Larry Eskridge's book on God's Forever Family, the Jesus People movement in America. Because what happens in that story is that Joe Rogan's talking about cars from the 1960s and music from the 1960s, and basically setting up a narrative that said, well, once the government cracked down on psychedelics, then we no longer had good music and we no longer had good cars. And again, if you listen to Burn Power, who lived a lot of this history, and if you read the first-person accounts of many people at this time, Peterson's point and Peterson's pivot is fairly validated, because what happened to a lot of these people who went off on psychedelics and sort of had their minds open to a bigger world was they also recognized they needed stability in that world. And for many of them, what that meant was the church. And what Joe Rogan didn't talk about, because of course he doesn't know anything about it, is the fact that actually a lot of what happened in evangelicalism and in the megachurch movement and in American evangelicalism that happened, let's say, downstream from the same people who were doing a lot of the psychedelics was the church. And of course, church music was transformed. I did a number of videos on this back when the Jesus Revolution movie came out. But it's interesting because Rogan sort of wants to say, well, if they would loosen up the laws and more people would do psychedelics, my question to that is always that, and then what? Now, it seems like Joe Rogan is a good husband and a good father. And I think a lot of this is probably because within Joe Rogan's own story, he was a latchkey kid. And I've seen this often with people that they didn't want to do to their children what they felt was done to them, and they didn't want it. So Joe Rogan, even though he has a very unusual biography, seems to be someone who, well, he obviously values stability, because you cannot do all of the Joe Rogan Experience podcasts that you do if you don't have the kind of discipline and stability in your life. And of course, for Joe Rogan, that's also involved in terms of martial arts and taking care of his body. And so even his playing with psychedelics for Joe Rogan is embedded within a structure and a discipline that probably keeps it from destroying the rest of his life. So it was very interesting in this conversation where Peterson didn't just follow up on Joe Rogan with his conversation about psychedelics and sort of go with Joe Rogan in that. Peterson, again, sort of brought it back to the religious posture. And I thought that was very interesting. Another thing that I saw in this was Peterson would tend to go through a lot of the things that he's been talking about. This is obviously stuff that's in his book, We Who Wrestle with God, which is coming out in November, and ran through a lot of that. And it didn't really sort of grip Joe. And I was thinking about how that is in some ways in contrast with the first appearance of Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan, which was a lot about what was happening in the culture war at the time. And of course, Jordan Peterson was under attack for what he was doing in the school. And so you had all of that. I had all of that culture war stuff. And it's interesting that Jordan, now that he's, he's sort of working out with this rearticulation of the stuff that's in his book, his rearticulation of this sort of putting together his perspective on the biblical material with his psychology, with the stuff that he really did bring out in the first times he was on the Joe Rogan Experience. He's not sort of, well, first of all, the times are different again, but it's not having the same impact it had when he did it. And it's always hard to know why things go whoosh. But so Jordan would talk, and then of course Joe would start talking about psychedelics, and then Jordan would talk, and Joe would talk a little bit more about psychedelics. But when Jordan got into, again, long themes of his personal responsibility, sacrifice, those themes, and attached them to the crucifixion, and he brought in Jung in terms of sort of an archetypal story and, worst case scenario, as it were. So you have the best man who ever lived, who's being crucified and punished in the worst possible way for the good things that he's done. And it was interesting. It was at that moment that Joe Rogan sort of caught on and said, I never heard that before with the crucifixion. And so I think that was sort of a meeting point. Now, I'm not going to play it because there's always issues in playing videos. Even though Joe Rogan is now back on YouTube, there's always issues in playing Joe Rogan videos, and I just don't want to deal with all that stuff. And the puppets are up on the shelf. That's why the puppets came out the first time, because they would go back and forth. Maybe I should walk through a little bit of the transcript. Earlier, when Rogan was talking about psychedelics, Peterson hit him with Jung's assertion that religion is to keep people from religious experience. And I think that sort of pushed Joe back a little bit, because Joe's idea was, well, maybe if people have religious experience induced by psychedelic drugs, but then the question is always, then what? Then what, Joe? Are they going to be better fathers and better mothers and more responsible members of community and more generous with people? Or will they just not be so narrow-minded in some of the ways that you don't think people should be narrow-minded? That's always the question that we sort of come back to. Now, the machine-generated transcripts are a little crazy, because both of these guys speak in chapters, not merely pages or paragraphs. And it's interesting. They both go a while. They go a while, and the other talks, and the other talks. So in that sense, it's sort of a strange conversation. It's always hard to sort of work from the transcript. All right, new transcript. All right, so I made a new transcript. Still didn't get it all right, but I fixed it up a little bit. This is Jordan talking. And if you want to establish the pattern of fatherhood that's going to cascade down the generations, that will make your descendants successful in a multi-generational manner, then you follow the spirit of adventure and you imbue your children with that confidence. And how's that pattern establishes a dynasty. So Abraham as the father of nations is established. So human reproduction is way more complex than just sex. And actually, I used some of this in my rough draft for Sunday this week. So now the promise that God makes to Abraham, in part, is that if you fall into that pattern of maximal adventure and courageous movement forward, that your life is imbued with a meaning that transcends time, and that you embody something like an archetypal and eternal spirit, and that's the spirit of the Father. That's why Abraham understands that he's made contact with the God of his ancestors, and if you're a good father, then you have the Spirit dwelling within you. And the Christian insistence is that the Spirit's identical to the Logos that bears the weight of the world on its shoulders voluntarily. Now, again, I expect this is exactly what we're going to find in Jordan's We Who Wrestle with God. And all of my critiques come to bear on this, that there's sort of a dual level that kind of takes over here. And there's an implied promise that if you take on this spirit of adventure, but let's say the implied in this is the idea that, well, okay, so here's the formula. All right, so he complains about how Christians sometimes use this as a formula. Let's think of the young man, and the young man's nation is attacked, and so the young man takes up the spirit of adventure, leaves his parents' house, joins the army, goes to the battlefield, and within weeks or months or a few years, gets killed on the battlefield. Has that formula worked? Now, part of it will, and Peterson's going to get into that. That's why Abraham understands that he's made contact with the God of his ancestors. And that's what brings everything into being. Stunning. It's a stunning conceptualization. I think it's right. It looks right to me. The idea that sacrifice is the basis of community. That's just obvious. Now, again, the young man who goes off to war, that sacrifice is the basis of community. Now, there's sort of levels here, and you could say that the young man who goes to war and is killed in battle, their sacrifice is the basis for the community. This is part of the reason I just finished this book on the Pope and Mussolini, where towards the end of Mussolini's life, there was one woman who put 5 bullets into his corpse, saying, one for each of my sons who gave his life for you, because Italy was very upset with Mussolini, because Mussolini basically follows Hitler into a whole bunch of things, and it ends very badly for Italy. You could argue it ended even worse for Germany. So that's sacrifice number one. That it's not about you. It's not about your wife. It's about the stability of your union across time, and it's about the stability of that union insofar as that's a reliable foundation for your children. So it's sacrificial too, and I think that's really gold. That's really good. Give up your whims in the present so that the future's stable. Give up your immaturity so that your children can thrive. That's a sacrificial gesture. And we figured it out. And I like what Jordan Peterson does here, because again, I'm not quite able to articulate this, but there are levels here. So we figured this out. And there's a sense in which there's a spirit of us and a collective us that's sort of established in a culture. And it's established in a culture of a family. It can be established in a national culture or a religious culture, and not the individuals aren't cognizant of it. They're not aware of it, but they practice that. I mean, one of the things that I notice is, for example, when I think about Why did my wife and I marry when we married? This was the cultural pattern that we just went through. That cultural pattern has been disturbed. This is what you do. Now, of course, many people followed those scripts. They didn't all end well for everyone, but and that's where you really have to be careful with this. And that's where I think again, a two worlds mythology that a full Christianity has can say to someone, okay, you're going to follow the script, you're going to follow the sacrifice, and the sacrifices will be made good on the other side. And of course, this is something that Jordan wrestles with. This came through pretty clearly in his conversation with Alex O'Connor. But it's at this point again that he sort of finally kind of breaks through to Joe Rogan. And the exploration of the New Testament is the limits of sacrifice. I'd really love to follow with him up with that. Can't wait till this book comes out. So you think that's what people think when they think of the cross? I think that's where, again, I'm just working. So that's what Joe Rogan asked. So you think that's what people think about when they think about the cross? And again, this gets into the question of cognizance, and it gets into the question of subtle bodies and the different kinds of bodies that we participate in, and how those bodies and those cultures move our actions forward. And of course, we have the individual level, and we have the individual level of participation. Now, again, when I think about, a little bit later, he's going to talk about Peterson Academy. I really like the part when he's first talking about Peterson Academy. I had to listen to this while the new transcript was being generated. We're not quite sure what college does. And Peterson says one of the things that college has done is mate selection. And that's very much how Calvin College, when I was there, when my parents were there, that's very much how it practiced, what happened with it. And so then there's sort of the individual participation in the larger collective culture, the larger collective spirit. And of course, as an individual, you have to ask yourself, am I going to sacrifice? Am I going to submit to this spirit? So obviously, in the 1980s, in a Christian college context, there was the idea that, well, you sacrifice your desire for sexual satisfaction with anyone who is willing to sleep with you, and you save yourself for marriage. Now, of course, so many of these cultures have come under attack and have been changed and disrupted by technology. So of course, Peterson's laying this out, and Joe Rogan says, do you think that's what people think of when they think of the cross? And Peterson responds, it's very hard to think about. It's very hard to know what people think about. I would say it depends on their level of sophistication, but it also depends a lot on their formation, if they're formed into this. Now, again, this gets to a degree into the culture of authenticity versus a culture of sincerity. If you're in a culture that has a high value of submitting to the culture and obeying the culture, and even if you're at a low place in the status, you sacrifice towards the spirit of the culture, then the argument is that there will be benefits and well-being. And I think part of what happened was, and part of what happens in terms of deconstruction, is that people say, well, I was a good person and I did sacrifice, and then these other things happened and it didn't play out. Now, again, what a two worlds mythology sort of offers you is to say, well, you will have treasures in heaven. And so this is part of the piece where Peterson continues to get into it. I don't think most people, I don't know if Joe Rogan said that again. I would have to go through and much more carefully detail this, because the AI didn't really differentiate their voices very well. And I don't think most people think about that the way that they think about it. They think Jesus died for our sins. Now, again, this then gets into it. So in what way Jesus died for your sins then connects up with this other narrative? And that's why I say part of the power of this two worlds mythology is I think it energizes and gives and affords some things that individuals themselves can't quite comprehend given their level of sophistication or their age. Again, my definition of a good culture is it affords wisdom to people, to individuals who haven't had the chance to accumulate it on their own yet. When you think back over your life, say who you were 40 years ago, and you look at all of your decisions, that then builds up wisdom, and now you can say to others, This is wisdom. Do this, don't do that. This gets into, let's say, biblical wisdom literature, which is not sort of algorithmic rules. If then, if this, then that. If you do this, then you will get that. And often what you see in certain religious communities is that they push it too hard. Because, well, maybe if you live by all your religious rules when you're young, then when you're old, those will all pay off. And again, most religious communities then sort of shift it up into the afterlife. And again, you have to be careful with that too. So I thought that was one of the most interesting and engaging parts of the conversation. And I thought that's at a part where it sort of got through to Joe. Right, Jordan Peterson continues, it's very formulaic. Surface level understanding is what we're talking about. It's partly, and then there's the merciful element to it, and that's what Jung is referring to when he said that religion helps protect people against religious experience. The full revelation of the significance, let's say, of the imitation of Christ, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christian belief, is in fact demand that you walk the same pathway. It's the most terrifying demand because Jung describes Christian passion as an archetypal tragedy. And then he goes through that, and he's been through that a number of times in his videos before. But again, what happens if you sort of disrupt the two worlds mythology? If you look at the question of Jesus, just, let's say, with the iron box of materialism, you say, okay, what's the story about Jesus? Well, Jesus doesn't, he sort of bucks many of his, let's say, his would-be religious allies, and he doesn't sort of enforce the culture war at his time. He's soft on the Roman occupation, let's say, according to some to his right. And then, let's say, those who are right and left, it doesn't really work. So for many, for the Pharisees, for the Zealots, Jesus is overly soft on the Roman occupation. But how about the other sides? The aristocracy, the Sadducees, Jesus is too extreme. And so then, well, what they can all agree on is that because Jesus hasn't sort of coalesced up with one of the tribes that would protect him, sort of like in a prison yard, they all agree, okay, Jesus can be killed. And then Jesus dies on a cross. And from a secular perspective, you say, okay, Jesus died on a cross. Now, of course, Jordan sort of flips then mythologically into the harrowing of hell and then the resurrection. But if the resurrection isn't historical, well, then the story will again have a different shape. And you might say, well, Jesus managed to conquer the West, or the idea of Jesus managed to conquer the West. But Jesus himself, as a living, breathing, individual entity, well, again, to take the materialist idea of death, well, he just ceases to have consciousness and have experience. And so the legends of Jesus sort of gets magnified all over the world. But Jesus himself, did Jesus gain anything by his sacrifice on the cross if you restrict it to a materialist story? And the answer would be no. Because the question would be, okay, he was killed by his enemies. What did Jesus get out of that? Nothing. And again, this is where a two worlds mythology would say, no, well, he's raised, he ascends, and reigns over heaven and earth. So again, I mean, it's interesting watching Jordan continue to work this. And again, I think the Alex O'Connor was one of the best conversations with Jordan. But this is a test here because Joe Rogan obviously has his ideas about his worldview. And so I was watching this thinking, okay, what will capture Joe Rogan's imagination? And it's interesting that here, this Point to the Cross did. A lot of the other stuff, Joe just sort of defaulted back to what he thinks about psychedelics and kind of a, let's say, a liberationist narrative that really got going during the counterculture. So there's a few ideas, a few thoughts. Maybe I'll post this now, have something for the weekend. So yeah, I'm back working on stuff, and I hope this was productive or helpful for you.